How do we keep feeding a growing population while at the same time reversing climate change and regenerating life on Earth? That's such an important and complicated question, but the great news is that there are so many promising solutions out there. I decided to start this podcast because I was tired of hearing about how bad things are, and I wanted to focus instead on how good things could be. This episode was made in partnership with Soul Capital. I am your host, Raphael, and this is the Deep Seed Podcast. My guest today is Chuck de Liedekerke. He is the co-founder and CEO of Soul Capital. It's a company that supports the transition to regenerative agriculture by financially rewarding farmers for improvements in the health of their soils. Hi, Chuck, and welcome.
Thanks for having me, Raphael.
I'd like to make sure right from the start that everyone listening is on board with the core topic of this discussion, which is regenerative agriculture. Could you maybe give us a brief explanation or definition of what regenerative agriculture is?
So, regenerative agriculture, probably the best way to describe it is to contrast it with extractive agriculture. Maybe I can tell you a story about this, which is actually the story of agriculture. About 12,000 years ago, we invented agriculture as a species. And since that moment, we've been slowly degrading the fertility of our planet. If you look at the places where agriculture was born, like Mesopotamia or Mexico or China, these areas have gradually turned to desert. And that's because agriculture is an artificial activity. What we mean by regenerative agriculture is the set of practices that are going to restore the natural fertility of these ecosystems. And the reason it's a very important notion is because historically, it's the first time that we are coming to terms with the fact that, yes, we have been degrading our soils for a long time. We've been accelerating that degradation for a while as well, especially more recently since the Industrial Revolution, since the mechanization and the arrival of industrial chemistry in agriculture. But this is a trend that's been going on for a long time. But this realization that we can actually reverse that and build fertility in our soils, precisely at a moment where the environment is under such stress, is actually huge news. And it deserves to be considered as probably a very, very important turning point in the history of mankind.
That's a very powerful statement right from the start. Love it. And I have to say, I completely agree with you. And that's the reason why I find this topic so interesting and so exciting. We obviously have a massive problem with the climate and the environment. And when you look at the data about greenhouse gas emissions, destruction of natural ecosystems, biodiversity loss, and so on, you also see that agriculture is one of the leading causes of these problems today. And what I love about regenerative agriculture is that it has the potential to turn one of the biggest problems into one of the biggest solutions. Anyway, I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about your personal journey. I know that you started your career working in the banking sector, but that didn't last very long, and you transitioned to agronomy, agriculture, and so on. And I'd like to know more about your story and how this transition happened.
Sure. So maybe we can even backtrack a little bit before my days as an investment banker.
Of course, yeah.
I was a student in philosophy, and it's always been important to me to have some purpose in what I do. And as the environmental challenges that we face have become more and more clear, it was natural at some point that I look at that. But before I was an investment banker, I was also an entrepreneur making films. I spent a few years producing films for NGOs and nonprofits. And I had this opportunity to see a lot of good that these nonprofits were doing, but also looking at their challenges. And one of the key challenges I found was because they weren't as embedded in the market as for-profit solutions might be, they usually had issues with scalability. And this is a key question that I keep asking myself, but I do think that if we are faced with such a global problem as climate disruption today, and as, global warming or global scorching, as people might be calling it, and the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of our water systems and all of the tipping points that we're talking increasingly about, if these problems are at scale, we probably need some form of responses at scale. And one of the reasons I went into finance was because I realized that there are a number of tools that you can gain there to understand how the world works. And so I have to say I'd learned a lot, and I enjoyed my time in finance precisely because it gives you the means to understand how the system can actually be reformed into being part of the solution.
So was that something that was already in the back of your mind at the time while learning about banking?
That was something
how
that was
to
already
use
in the back of
those
your mind
tools
when
and
you,
how to use the
got
power
into
of the
the
market
finance, was to learn these tools
to
so
change
that
the
you
world for
change
the
the
better.
world.
So yeah, you can put it that way. I had no idea that I wanted to go into agriculture, but I did know I wanted to do something meaningful. And at some point, my boss in the investment bank where I was working noticed I was looking at other options, and he asked me, what do you want to do? And it was a very simple question, but I realized that I had no idea what I wanted to do, and that was the trigger for me to start really thinking about what I wanted to do. And maybe one prompt to the audience of this podcast is before you start doing something different, ask yourselves truly, what is it that you want to do? There's no scarcity of problems. Which ones do you want to tackle? And the answer came to me by chance when I saw a TED Talk, which is one of the most viewed TED Talks today, by a gentleman called Alan Savory. And the TED Talk is called How to Regreen Deserts and Reverse Climate Change. And if you have 20 minutes of your life to spend on something other than this podcast, then this is what you should be looking at, because it's a very, very powerful message about livestock and how livestock can actually be used to either degrade large areas of grassland or regenerate them. And the way Alan Savory puts it is fascinating. What he says is livestock are actually wild herbivores that have been domesticated. And if you look at what wild herbivores do, they bunch themselves to protect themselves from predator. But because they're bunched together, they're constantly urinating and defecating on their own food. And so this kind of need to keep moving all of the time. And it's that movement and that constant fertilization of the livestock on the soil that creates this link of symbiosis between the animals and the plants. And what we did by domesticating animals and creating paddocks for them where they would be protected from predators over generations and generations is we stopped these migratory movements and we overgrazed some areas. And we brought down the vegetation and created deserts in that way. That's not the only way we created deserts, but that's one of the key ways. And so simply by bunching animals and moving them in more concentrated areas across a paddock, you can already start regenerating the land. And the images that Alan Savory shows in this TED Talk are amazing because in a few years, you turn what almost looks like a desert into green, lush pastures. And that was the light bulb moment for me. That's when I realized what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I also remember watching that TED Talk a few years back, and it had a big impact on me as well. And I think that's because most people are tired of hearing about problems all the time. And here you have someone who's presenting an amazing solution that is regreening deserts and restoring degraded lands into productive lands that are also sequestering carbon.
I think it was really powerful because it ticked so many boxes at the same time. It ticked the box of regreening deserts, ensuring food production and livelihoods for people. You know, the difference between a desert and a fertile land, whether it's a forest, a grassland, a cropland as well. The big difference is photosynthesis. Plants photosynthesize. They suck carbon out of the atmosphere, store it into their vegetation. When the vegetation degrades, that carbon is returned to the soil. And the difference between, yellow sand and rich black soil is the color, and that's mainly, not only, but mainly carbon. So it stores carbon as well. There's the whole biodiversity topic that's extremely rich as well. But really, again, Alan Savory said it very well. He said, desertification is responsible for unrest, social breakdown, war, migration, all of these topics where people need to move away from their land if it degrades. And if you can actually restore the fertility of that land, it's not just about the environment, it's about people, it's about society. And that's really one thing that got me very excited. And I'd say the other thing that got me excited is this is not a philanthropic thing, right? There's like a very, very serious business case to this. You can buy desertifying unproductive land for very cheap. And if you regenerate its fertility, you can bring people back on that land. You increase the value of that land, but you can also get economic activity to return back on that land. And it's not just the productive value of the land, it's all of the economic activity that people bring with it. So, there's a huge infrastructure and nation building play when you're regenerating land. And so because it makes so much business sense, this was kind of the aha moment that I wanted, because previously I had been, having seen a lot of nonprofits and NGOs work, I was thinking, maybe, the only way we're going to save the world is through philanthropy, but I saw the limits of philanthropy. Not to say that philanthropy doesn't do any good. It's very necessary, but there's a limit to how much it can scale. But if there's a business case, then really this can harness the power of the markets to actually do something at scale. And that's why I liked regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, that's something that I've learned from the conversations I've had with farmers in previous episodes of this podcast. Regenerative agriculture seems to tick all the boxes for me. You regenerate nature, you give the farmers a better livelihood, and it makes sense from an economic perspective as well.
Yeah. And then to go further, it's a super meaningful solution to climate change. It's not like 2% of the solution. Like we say today, agriculture is 10 to 20% of global emissions. And that's, we can, if you look at carbon emissions at field level, today in our regions, we are emitting about a ton and a half per hectare. give or take, and you can drive those emissions to zero, which means that you can solve 10 or 20% of the solution of the problem. Sorry, but you can also drive those emissions down further than zero. You can sequester carbon through photosynthesis. By the moment the crop leaves the field, harvested, that crop can actually have contributed to sequestering carbon into the soil to the tune of 1.5 tons sequestered per hectare. So that's actually solving more of the carbon problem than just its own share. Potentially it's 20 to 40% of the problem. And that's huge. And that's just carbon. We can talk about biodiversity. We can talk about water. We can talk about farmers' livelihoods, et cetera. That's also an exciting point. And then, I think there's a last point why I was excited about it is reconnection with the farmers, reconnection with the land, reconnection with the soil. And I think as a society, we've spent our, this entire story of civilization, painstakingly moving away from the land, because let's not kid ourselves. If you don't have machines and if you only have your hands and your back to work the soil, it's a really painful job. But in the process of moving into cities and not thinking about how our food is produced, I do think we've lost a connection to our planet. And we need to regain that connection because we need to understand what the problems we're facing are. We need to feel them, and we need to understand that, I just think we need to understand our planet, basically.
How do we do that? Reconnect with the land, while most people today are living in big cities completely disconnected from where the food is grown?
I think one very important thing is to talk with the people that are connected to the soil. A lot of us have quite a binary approach to what farming is. Either farming is, this terrible system of industrial factory farms and industrial feedlots and animal cruelty and GMOs on the one hand, and then the farmers market and permaculture on the other. But really, it's a spectrum. And what I've come to realize is that every time at the heart of any farming system, good or bad, or anything in between, there's a farmer. And that farmer is the first person who understands his system. And sometimes not in the way that we might expect them to, but they understand the system. And so if we want to reconnect with the land, I guess it's important to talk to these people. I'll tell you another story. When I first founded Soil Capital with Nicholas and with Alex, we wanted to buy degraded land in Australia because it was, I kind of say it's like New York. It's a tough environment. And if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere.
Right.
And so we had found these regions where you had, very, very concerning degradation of the land, loss of fertility, salinization of the land, water systems were disappearing. So huge ecosystem problems. And we were thinking, if we can invest there, then maybe we can, show how we can regenerate these ecosystems. And it's a wonderful case study. Well, we arrived there, and I arrived there one day to meet with farmers. And one of the people I met with wasn't a farmer, but he was the local banker to farmers. And you could tell that he was very close to the farmers. And I explained with quite some pride and satisfaction my regenerative agriculture projects. And he looks at me and he says, you're not really interested in farming, you're not interested in agriculture, you're not interested in the land. And I look at him and said, no, of course, this is why I'm doing it. And I was taken aback. I really had plenty of good intentions. He says, no, you don't care. And then he explains himself and he says, you've grown up as a city boy. It's true. You've worked in a city all your life. That's true. And you arrive and halfway across the world. I was living in London at the time. You arrive halfway across the world and explain to me and to the farmers that have been working this land that you're going to be regenerating the land that they've destroyed. But what you fail to understand is that these people have been taking care of this land for longer than you can imagine, and they are going to transmit this land to their own families. And they have concerns for this land that you haven't even thought about. And they know every hectare and possibly, every acre or square meter of this land better than you ever could. So don't start by judging what people are doing. Start by, walking in their shoes and understanding what they're going through. Obviously, they're deeply concerned about what's going on. And if they could, find a way to farm differently and still make a living in the system, they definitely would, because who has a better interest in the fertility of this land? You, banker from London, or the farmer who's on the land now? And so for me, the first way to connect to the land is to spend time talking to the people that know the land best, to understand their challenges, to understand that nature, it's not just a nice thing. Nature treats you very well sometimes, but nature treats you very harshly sometimes as well. Right? I think the best example is, the ocean. Sometimes the ocean is a sunny day at the beach, but sometimes the ocean is a small ship in the middle of a hurricane at night. That's nature for you. And, the farmers experience nature in all of its productivity, but also in all of its difficulty and violence. And if we're not able to understand that those are the challenges that we face as a society, and that the farmer is in the front line of it, then, it's worth taking the time to understand it.
Right. So taking the time to appreciate the complexity of farming and the hard work that farmers are doing, and making sure that they are at the center of any discussions about the future of food systems. Getting back to your story, you went to Australia to buy land. You learned an important lesson in humility, I guess. What happened next?
Yeah, so we wanted to we wanted to create a fund that would invest in degrading land across the world. Australia was our first target geography, but actually we never invested. We came across a series of people who already owned land, sometimes large portfolios of land, and who understood that we had, a plan to manage land regeneratively, and who offered to us the possibility of regenerating their farmland portfolios. And when I say we, maybe it's important to talk about the other founders of Soil Capital as well. We're three of us. Nicholas Verschure is the second founder, and he's an agronomist and a farmer, and he's been farming regeneratively ever since he's been old enough to walk in a field, which has been, he's been doing it since he was a kid. And he's got a very, very concrete understanding of this stuff. So, we weren't coming into this business with just, finance hats on. There was practical experience, and there was business experience. And I think it's the combination of the two that created the success. And the other founder is Alex Traynor, and he comes from agribusiness financing. And today, Nicholas is leading the agronomic aspects of Soil Capital. Alex is the chief financial officer, and so we still work as a trio. But at the time, our goal has always been to make regenerative agriculture mainstream. But the way we wanted to do it at the time was by investing ourselves in land, regenerating the land, and showing that the financial returns that we could capture from regenerative operations was greater than from conventional operations. And then leading by example, we could show that this was the right way to do this, and any reasonably minded operator or owner of farmland would say, okay, well, given this example, well, I'll just go regenerative. I think it was a little bit naive at the time, but it did get us introduced to some people that were willing to trust us with their land. And so between the years 2014 and 2018, we did exclusively farmland management and advisory services. And then we came to this realization that if we were managing land ourselves or even advising land ourselves, there would kind of be a limit to how much impact we would have. And so that's when we started thinking about working with farmers.
Okay, so you initially spent a few years managing farmland, transitioning it to regenerative agriculture, and you were trying to prove that it could be more profitable than conventional. Did you manage to do that? Did you get any promising results there?
Yes, that's a very important point. When we arrived, really on most of the farming operations where we had a management or an advisory mandate, really we saw year-on-year profitability and resilience go up. I'd like to say productivity, and I'll explain this. Well, the best way to do it is to give you a story again. When we were managing the grape production of a client in South Africa, we were faced with a drought in 2017, a very, very tough drought for the Western Cape in South Africa. The city of Cape Town was at risk of not having any drinking water, and they were calculating the days before Cape Town would run out of drinking water, calling it, day 100, which was 100 days before the city would run out, then day 95 and day 90. And we arrived at like day 90, and 90 days without, 90 days is
before you run out of water completely.
Of drinking water
day
for
zero.
A whole city is like a huge state of emergency. And they had already, way before that, they had made irrigation for agriculture illegal because they were keeping the water for the people. And so you can imagine no rain plus no irrigation plus super heat stress as well created the perfect conditions for the vines to just not grow anything or actually die. And a lot of farmers in that region didn't harvest a crop. Just about every farmer lost money that year, and quite a few farmers actually saw their vines die and had to rip out their production tools, the vines themselves. That year, because of the regenerative operations that we were implementing, we were one of the rare, if not the only farm to turn a positive operating profit there. And for us, that was a huge discovery moment, where we realized, okay, in periods of climate stress, we will be more productive than extractive farms, if I were to call it that way. In normal years, we should be as productive. So we'll never be less productive in a regenerative system. We'll always be at least as productive. That's, I think, the important thing. So to answer your question, did we see profitability go up? Yeah. We saw resilience go up. I think we also saw the farmers' interest in their job change. And that was one of the key learnings, which is the toughest thing to change in a regenerative system is the mindset of a farmer. And that's not because the farmer doesn't want to do something different. I think the farmer spends they spend their time thinking about what they can do differently. But, they think about this day in, day out. And so when you, as someone who doesn't know their context, even if you're a farmer from another country, or even if you're a farmer from a few miles away and you tell a farmer to do something differently, the first thing they're going to think is, well, maybe it works elsewhere, but this is my system and I know my system really, really well. So, I've been optimizing my own system with what I know. Why would I change? And so really what we understood is the toughest thing to change if we want to change agriculture is what happens, between the two ears of the farmers.
Right. I can sense that you have a huge amount of respect for farmers and you're trying really hard not to say anything negative about them. But at the same time, you're telling me that when you're taking over farmland that is degraded and transition it to regenerative systems, you get better results. You regenerate nature, you have a better profitability, more resilience, and so on. So clearly, we need to transition as much as possible.
On the one hand, you're telling me that we need to listen to them and they know their land better than everyone else.
But to do that, you have
but on the other hand, you're
tell
sort of
farmers
also
that
telling
what
me
they're
that
doing is
they
maybe
need to learn
ideal,
new
not
practices
optimal.
or change their practices. So they don't know it all.
So how
yet.
do you
and so
propose
how
to
do you
do
bridge
that?
that gap?
Well, first of all, with a lot of humility. We spend quite some time trying to understand why farmers would change and why farmers wouldn't change. And the three reasons that we found was lack of technical knowledge to do some new stuff. And again, we can look at examples. A farmer will probably be afraid to establish a cover crop if he hasn't done it before because of potentially weed infestation or pest infestation problems. You're going to bring in pests in your system that you didn't previously have. How are you going to deal with those? The second reason why farmers don't change is the fear of an economic loss. They believe that their system is optimized as it is. And it's a series of compromise, but these are the best compromise they can, land on to achieve the profitability they have. And then the last one is a lack of a clear economic incentive. And this is the most powerful one I find. The reason is,
Yeah, because the fear is not going to change. So you need some kind of motivation somewhere to make them get over this fear and try something new. Or you need some kind of protection also in case something happens, right? Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point. Take the story of organic agriculture. At some point people decided that, too much chemistry in the system was probably bad for you from a health perspective. Maybe from an environmental perspective, but I think that, organic emerged because of concerns for human health. And so some farmers decided to stop with chemistry in agriculture, especially synthetic inputs, especially synthetic nitrogen. But synthetic nitrogen is what will boost your yields most. And so by going from a conventional system to an organic system, the first thing the farmer is going to see is a drop in his productivity. And what we've observed is that there's been a growing number of farmers adopting adopting organic agriculture. And they knew that there was going to be less productivity. And if you're going to take less productivity, that means that you really need to see that there's a premium and their price is going to go up more than your productivity is going to drop. And the reason that's a nice story is because it tells you that if you can create a financial incentive for the farmer, well, the farmer will find a way. These guys and girls, they're entrepreneurs. And so we don't need to be completely holding their hand at every point of the journey. If we can create an incentive that says, okay, this makes sense and this opens the door for me to start learning new things again and to start taking charge of my own business, then they'll do it. So, how do we get farmers to change? We certainly don't tell them what to do. We tell them what results we're looking for. And the results we'll be looking for are, all of the benefits that come from regenerative agriculture. Sure, we'll look at carbon, but let's look at biodiversity as well. Let's look at, how farming will impact the water system, how farming will impact the quantity of pesticides that the farmers will be applying. Let's look at farmer livelihoods. Let's look at soil health generally. Let's look at, all of these metrics that we can actually point to say, yes, the land is actually regenerating. And a society on that land and people on that land are actually thriving better than they were previously. Those are the metrics that we're after.
So just going back to soil capital, you said that the first few years were about managing farmland and transitioning it to regenerative agriculture. And you got some promising results, but you felt limited in your ability to scale your environmental impact. And that's when soil capital evolved into something different. Could you explain what soil capital does today?
Today, soil capital runs a regenerative agriculture and climate action program where we help the food system to scale regenerative agriculture.
And I guess that's the key, the central question to this whole discussion is, how do we do that? How do we scale regenerative agriculture?
Well, by putting the farmer at the center of the equation and making sure that whatever we propose works for the farmers. Because, I said food system, and I mean that the food system is not just the farmers. It's also the companies that will be working in the ag and food industry. So anywhere from tractor manufacturers to food brands, to industrial processors, to cooperatives working with farmers, all of these companies are part of the system. The retailers, the supermarkets, they're part of the system as well. And you and I, as consumers, are part of the system as well. So that's who we're changing the system for. And everyone has a role to play in there. That's really important. And everyone has an interest in it succeeding. So let me talk about the role first. Everybody's role, I think, is to make this achievable and interesting for the farmer so that it can happen at scale. That's the first role. And we help everybody in the system make it interesting for the farmer. And I'll explain that now, and then I'll explain why everyone has an interest in doing it. If I forget, remind me. The way we do it is we enable farmers to come in to a regenerative agriculture and climate program, our program, and we will measure their practices every year in a way that's actually interesting and fun for them. We don't want to burden the farmers with too much admin.
And what is that?
So basically, it's for about 2 hours, 3 hours a year. The farmers will sit down with some agronomists in our team. We have, around 25 agronomists working in the team today. And they're going to collect information about the farmers' soils and about the farmers' farming practices into our systems. And we will feed that data into a model that will help us understand if the farmer is storing carbon or emitting carbon at the level of his whole farm, his or her whole farm. We will be also assessing, what type of impact these practices might have on other metrics that I mentioned earlier. And then we'll understand, the farmer's carbon impact as a proxy, an imperfect proxy, but a good proxy nonetheless, about the farmer's regenerative practices. And then we'll certify that. And by certifying the farmer's carbon performance on any given year for any given crop, we can help the farmer send regenerative crops into the food system and get paid to send regenerative crops into the food system.
So let me check if I understood this correctly. Each year, you collect a wide range of information and data about each farm. And that allows you to estimate the amount of carbon released or sequestered as a result of farm operations. And then you're able to get this carbon certified, to be able to sell it as carbon certificates. And that gives the farmers an extra source of income. And I understand also that carbon isn't really what matters here. It's just a proxy that you're using. So it's the best proxy you have available today to measure or estimate the health of a farm, the health of a soil, its ability to hold moisture, and so much more. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable talking about certificates because certificates is a way, can be perceived as, just another financial instrument and something that will be used to trade carbon. And that's not the point at all here.
Right, yeah, because we hear a lot about carbon offsets, but this is not what we're talking about here. Right? Maybe it's a good moment to discuss the difference actually between a carbon offset and a carbon.
Let's rather than calling it offsets or certifications or certificates, let's call it a certification of the farmer's carbon performance. I think,
right.
And what we will value with the farmer is how good they're doing in terms of storing carbon and adopting regenerative practices globally. That's really what's important. Carbon offsets, carbon credits, are an instrument that enables a company that's outside of the food and ag value chain to buy those credits and to say, look, I'm achieving carbon neutrality with my credits. I'm compensating my own emissions. And it's not just agriculture, it's forestry, cook stoves. There are plenty of projects like this. And many are good projects, right? I'm not saying that they're bad projects at all. What I'm saying is sometimes there's an issue there because if you don't change, if you're a business that buys carbon credits and you change nothing to your ways of doing business, but you've just bought some carbon credits from people that are doing all the effort, you can end up by claiming carbon neutrality by not really asking yourselves the right questions about your own business. So if you're an airline, for example, and you're, not doing anything to reduce your emissions and you just buy carbon credits somewhere in the market, well, that's going to be an issue. There's also an issue in the carbon credit market because a lot of carbon credit projects were put in place, sometimes with poor oversight, bad governance, and now they're like a series of issues arising from projects that were poorly followed up on. And so all of this has a really, really dodgy reputation. And again, I want to be clear, everybody has a responsibility in looking at what are the right projects, and some of these projects still deserve to be invested in. But, we at Soil Capital have chosen not to go into carbon credits because there's something that's more interesting for the food and ag supply chain, is that the food and ag companies, they don't need to buy carbon credits. They can buy their own crop and make it regenerative.
Right.
And that will actually decrease their own carbon footprint. Because if you look at the carbon footprint of a food product, what's interesting is usually, I think it's 70 to 80%, sometimes much more. We were speaking with a client yesterday who has 98% of their emissions comes from the farm, you know?
Right.
And this is a food brand. 98% of their emissions comes from the farm. So if you want to change the carbon impact of your food, the best way to do it is through agriculture. And the best way to do that is by incentivizing the farmer. So that's one of the reasons why we have an interest in helping the farmers and supporting the farmers. But the other reason I think is even more dramatic. It's food security. We're entering a world where climate stress is going to cause more and more crop failures, harvest failures. And, we are entering into a world with record temperatures, with extreme patterns of rainfall and drought. And if we don't very quickly identify the farmers that are the regenerative farmers and scale these groups of farmers in the areas that are at risk, there are going to be real supply problems. You want some examples?
Sure, you can give me some, yeah.
All right. This year, in several countries, McDonald's wasn't able to put tomatoes in their burgers because they couldn't find any tomatoes on the market. And can you imagine how important it is for McDonald's to have a standardized product? So, this is not like an anecdote. This is a huge topic. I heard recently from McCain that in the past 10 years, they've lost 12% of their yields because of climate stress. And so for us, we live in privileged economies, and food isn't a huge portion of our income. But, in the rest of the world, where food is sometimes 60%, 70% of your daily income, imagine what happens when food prices, because of scarcity, double. You go from being able to eat 2 meals a day to one meal a day. Those are the real issues we're talking about. And so if we don't invest today in food security, not only will corporates like McDonald's and McCain not be able to supply their raw materials, but imagine the geopolitical instability that we face. That's no longer just a story of, global warming, blah, blah, blah. It's a story of national security and international security.
If that's such an important topic and the consequences could be so dramatic, why are we not investing more in regenerative practices, in regenerating our soils, in making sure that we have more resilience in food production systems? Why are we so slow to transition?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, we always talk about this triangle of the public sector, the private sector, and citizens deflecting responsibility on each other. And I think there's something about that. I think the consumers today, especially in privileged economies that emit the most carbon and that degrade the environment the most, they still haven't understood how urgent the situation is. I'm a part of it. We haven't understood the urgency yet. We haven't changed our lifestyles radically enough to adapt to the situation. We're not willing to elect governments that want to take these radical steps, and companies aren't yet compelled to do that. I kind of see this changing, and I think the European Union, for one, is taking great steps in the right direction for this. But I think we need to go much further. And by the way, I do think that as professionals, we have a clear role to play in this. But we can talk about that later if you want.
Going back to the timeline, you went from managing farms to incentivizing and financially stimulating farmers' transition to regen ag. How's that been so far? What kind of results are you getting?
Yeah. So we launched our regenerative program in 2020 and brought in 100 farmers the first year. The pilot was 30 years, but that was just a pilot. then 400 farmers the next year. Last year we had 1,000 farmers, and this year will be at least at 1,600 farmers. So it's growing nicely. And this is just in the geographies where we're active today, which is France, Belgium, and the UK. We're also looking to go into other geographies, but we'll announce that when we're ready.
Interesting.
We are though seeing great results already with the farmers that we're working with. So in the first year, the farmers improved from the previous year by collectively storing 30,000 tons of carbon. 30,000 tons, to give you a rough idea, is about 3,000 Western European citizens. That's the annual emissions of 3,000 citizens. That was 100 farmers carrying on their shoulders what 3,000 citizens have, emitted. Or the following year, it was 150,000. So like an order of magnitude more. Again, 15,000 Western European citizens. So really the farmers can be a clear part of the solution. And I think that's a narrative that's important to push.
And do you think you can go much further with this process? It's still early days. It's still quite a new concept. The laws on a European level are evolving a lot at the moment.
Yeah, I think we can go much further. So policy is going to change a lot. And I think for the better. I think as I said, the European Union with laws like the carbon removal certification framework is going to drive change. I also think that technically there's a lot that's happening. There are a lot of companies that are doing a lot of good to start thinking about what are the tools and products that we need to farm more regeneratively, what are the systems that we need to farm more regeneratively. I've often been saying there's been a moment where there's been a mechanical revolution for agriculture right after the war, where big tractors started arriving. There's been a moment where chemical agriculture has been something of a revolution as well, probably in the 50s. And then now we're seeing that the mechanical and chemical advances we did in the 21st century, well, we're making the same biological advances. We're understanding soil life. We're understanding the way that the environment actually does to grow stuff naturally. And if we can harness what nature does for free naturally, for the benefit of the system, I think actually we'll be able to maintain the productivity that we need, and at the same time reconcile our relationship with, between agriculture and the environment. That's really important. And I think that there's a lot of scientific knowledge that's now being developed, a lot of companies that are looking at this, a lot of technology that's being put to work in the right way for this. And this, one of the great examples I see here is a company called BioBest that does integrated pest management. Integrated pest management is basically how can you develop the insects that are going to become the predators of the pests in your system. So rather than having chemistry, develop, bring insects back into the environment. We hear that we've lost 75% of the insect population in the countryside since the 1970s. That's a huge number. Well, now we see that there's a commercial reason to bring them back, and I love it. And I think the other driver of change that I'm really that really means a lot to me is the social driver of change. I think farmers have been testing regenerative systems for many years now. Some farmers have been farming regeneratively before this was even a word. But now that it's becoming something that's a little bit more established, farmers are talking to themselves more and more. Communities are emerging that are sharing knowledge. And, we see that farmers in our programs have created WhatsApp groups amongst themselves to start exchanging on this topic. And so you see that with this knowledge being shared and more farmers testing and testing and testing, well, the ability for the right practices to scale is actually huge. And I'm really excited about that.
Right. So do you think we can transition every piece of land that we use today for agriculture to regenerative agriculture? And if so, how long would that take?
So can we transition every piece of land to regenerative agriculture? To put it provocatively, I think we don't have a choice.
Right.
And I think it's really the best way to farm as well. We don't have a choice because in the face of climate stress, extreme weather events, the degradation of our soils, there is starting to be no other way than to farm regeneratively. This is how you're going to preserve the value of your farm. This is how you're going to produce a healthy and abundant crop in a living system that's going to be valued by society, that's going to earn you extra income as a farmer, and that's going to reconnect you to society and the soil in the right way. The reason I say this is, for a while, I think it's less the case now, but for a while, farmers have been regarded as people that have been destroying the planet. And it's a lonely position to be in when you're a farmer, to be destroying the planet. First of all, it's already pretty lonely to be a farmer because generally your neighbors are far away from you. Financially, it's complicated to be a farmer because your margins are tight and your debts are usually huge. If people think that you're destroying the planet and poisoning your food, then it becomes even tougher. And I think that regenerative agriculture kind of flips the switch on all of those issues. So that's why it's the right way to farm. And then something I often say is the cost of doing nothing are much greater than the costs of changing.
If there's farmers listening to this podcast right now who might be really interested in maybe changing some of the practices, what advice would you have for them?
We tend not to give advice to farmers because really farmers know their context much better than we do. We might encourage them to talk to other farmers, potentially to look at regenerative agriculture programs where they might earn a little bit more. Generally engage them to start a conversation. And obviously, if a farmer wants to go on the Soil Capital website, then they should, and we'll be more than happy to get back in touch with them.
If I'm a farmer, why should I contact Soil Capital? What's in it for me?
Whether you're a farmer who's already advanced in their regenerative transition or a farmer who's thinking about it, we do have something for you. The reason is you can get paid in both ways. It's not because you're a pioneer that you've already been doing a lot of good stuff that you even still need to progress. If you're already sequestering carbon, if you're already adopting regenerative practices, we will compare you to the average of the regional practices. And you'll be compensated based on the difference between you and most of the farmers in your area. But if you're a farmer that's doing what most of the farmers in the area are doing, then you'll be compared on your own improvements.
Right. So the baseline is different for every farmer.
The baseline is going to be different, and there's compensation for everybody. As I said, there's a sense of community. I think most farmers who come into our program quickly end up connecting not only with the agronomists in our team, and we see that we have many, many conversations with farmers to accompany them along their transition, but also with farmers in their vicinity. And one of the nice things about being in a regenerative program when you're a farmer is, it's data driven. So you will know what your carbon performance is. These are things that are discussed amongst farmers, and you can learn from other farmers who, in similar contexts, soil context, cropping contexts, as you might be doing. We usually try to identify in different regions who are the farmers that have the best carbon performance and get them to share their experience with other farmers in the area. And those are usually really popular sessions because it creates the right type of interactions between farmers.
I love that it also brings a sense of community. And you mentioned how difficult it is for a lot of farmers. Not only that job is incredibly difficult and sometimes poorly rewarded financially, but also quite lonely because the communities have slowly disappeared away from the farm regions and into the cities over time. And if we can rebuild these communities of farmers together, and I think that's a great great thing.
I don't want to make the job of the farmer sound more difficult than it is. I think in certain circumstances it can be incredibly difficult, but I also think there are many farmers that are passionate people and that really love their job and they love improving. And I think, this is kind of the mindset that we want to foster is there's a passionate community of people out there who really love talking about regenerative practices, regenerative farming. Usually it's done around a regenerative beer when we can host events, and that's a lot of fun. And we also try to create interactions between farmers and the companies that are their clients ultimately. A lot of these companies, they want to meet the farmers. And we see that farmers are actually quite happy to talk to these businesses to understand, okay, why is it that you have an interest in paying us to lower our carbon footprint? These are meaningful conversations. We were talking about reconnection earlier. It's not just, okay, hi, what's your name? It's nice to meet you. Is, tell me about why your business is important to me. Farmer to company and company back to farmer.
What about businesses in the food industry, actually? We have the farmers on the one hand making an effort to be more regenerative to the benefit of everyone, the entire society, right? But in your experience, are companies within the food industry ambitious enough in their sustainability and regenerative strategies?
Yeah, well, I think companies are across the spectrum. And certainly, by and large, they're not taking their responsibilities enough. You have a few pioneers, but for a lot of these companies, they see this as a very deep strategic choice. And I think a lot of people are terrified to make decisions because it's new, it's a little bit disruptive. But, let's be honest here. There's one generation of farmers that can change the situation here. And they know what they need to do. They're lacking an incentive. And it's really time to support them now. Because in 5-10 years, we will be past these tipping point scenarios that terrify us much more than making a wrong business decision. And what we've seen is corporates that need to make these decisions shouldn't be that scared of making them. It's going to be better security of supply in the long run. The cost of inaction is much greater than the cost of action. And the farmers and the corporates, aren't going to get it exactly right the first time, but there's such an urgency to do it now and to be part of the solution rather than the problem that corporates should act. And they shouldn't wait for everything to be perfect because it's never going to be perfect. But farmers know what they need to do. Corporates, frankly, know what they need to do. And really now is the time to act.
We spoke about farmers and businesses, but what about politicians? Are legislations going in the right direction when it comes to incentivizing transition to more regenerative food systems?
So, I think legislation will advance at its pace. It's doing it with a lot of determination. And I think that's a good thing. But legislation will only be able to adopt and scale the solutions that already exist out there. And there are practicable solutions that exist. And if we want legislation to adopt those solutions, then businesses need to adopt them first. And I think the first responsibility to really accelerate change is with businesses today. And I'll say it even differently. I think the real responsibility with anyone, if you're listening to the podcast, this means you, it's not necessarily your personal life. What you do in your personal life is important, eating less red meats, taking fewer airplanes, taking the bike rather than the car, switching off the lights, all of that matters. But what you do in your professional life matters more, because you can have a much bigger impact in your professional life than in your personal life. And if you're listening to the podcast, then probably this stuff is important to you. So if I can encourage you to do one thing, is in your corporate life, in your professional life, drive the decisions now that matter. And the decisions, they're not more analysis, they're not more strategy, they're certainly not more communication. They are, what change am I delivering on the ground? If you can have an impact on agriculture today, is how am I making sure that I'm incentivizing farmers who are at the center of all this to actually deliver change? Am I already incentivizing farmers? And you were asking me if corporates are doing enough. I think a lot of corporates are still at the stage where they're strategizing. I don't think enough corporates today are sending money to farmers.
I think the message was sent loud and clear to everyone listening.
And that's the reason why also I've decided
there's
to
one
start this
criticism
podcast,
I've
to
heard a
amplify
few
this sort of
times
messages, and I
about
hope they
regenerative
find the right
agriculture,
ears
and
and
it's
they can
the use of the term itself,
make a difference.
as opposed to using a term like agroecology, because agroecology has been used for a very long time. It has been clearly defined and ratified by the UN. So there's a clear set of rules
like
to be followed,
that is
to be
more
considered
widely recognized
agroecological.
that's been
While
ratified by
with regenerative
the UN,
agriculture, it's a
there's
very
clear set
new
of
term
rules to follow,
that hasn't
and
been clearly
regenerative
officially
agriculture is a
defined
rather
yet,
new
and
term,
some claim that this
that
might
hasn't
be
been
an
quite,
issue. So
clearly
why
defined
did you
yet.
choose to stick with the
So,
term regenerative agriculture instead of
with this
agroecology, for example?
not the
I don't feel that strongly about what term is used. I really care about the outcomes. What I care is that the soil's natural fertility gets regenerated, that soil life returns, that biodiversity returns, that the water system is cleaner and that and cycles better through the system. I think we shouldn't get too hung up on definitions, because the moment we come up with like a very, very rigid definition of this stuff, it'll become a box ticking exercise. So yes, it's important that someone defines regenerative agriculture out there and that it's done smartly. But what I'm personally interested in is making sure that farmers are adopting the right practices and that businesses that are investing with farmers that are farming regeneratively are doing this for the right reasons, which is ensuring a long-term abundance and access to food, to healthy food, ensuring that farmers are thriving when they're farming, ensuring that we all have a viable future for ourselves, and by doing so, ensuring that these businesses have a future for themselves as well. And the good news is, what we see is the most proactive businesses doing this. This is really what they have in mind, and there's a clear business case for them in doing this, simply because this is how they're still going to be around in 10, 20, 15 years.
Yes, I completely understand, but what I'm worried about is that it kind of leaves the door open for greenwashing. Companies who are doing the bare minimum could be saying, hey, look at us, we are regenerative. They could easily claim that they're selling 100% regenerative products, while in fact
what I'm worried about is
their true impact on nature is
say, hey, look,
still quite extractive.
In a regenerative way, but they're not really doing much. They're just using the term because it hasn't been clearly defined.
No, you're not
Nothing
worried.
stops them
That's
from
a
using the
risk.
term. Am I wrong to
what I would
to
say
be worried
is,
about that?
If you're only looking at regenerative agriculture to make sure, like, if you're saying, can someone certify that my farm is regenerative, tick, then probably you're not paying enough attention to your farmer. There needs to be, some peeling of the onion that needs to happen. Anyone who's serious about regenerative agriculture needs to look a little bit more inside the farming practices. Okay, what's happening? Needs to go out and meet some farmers. Okay, is the land really regenerating here? So, what you're saying is right. There needs to be this definition, and the carbon removal certification framework at the European Union level is taking care of, making sure that carbon is being mapped in the right way. The Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform has defined regenerative agriculture. We work with a local cooperative here, Cultivae, who has its own definition of
one thing I will say in favor of
so there
regenerative
are
agriculture as well is that,
where,
in my opinion, it's a much stronger term for marketing.
Regenerative agriculture.
If I talk to people who are new to the topic about regenerative agriculture, it's really easy to explain that
really
we're going from an extractive model of agriculture to a regenerative one, and
that's
it's really easy for people to get excited about that.
Sure
but when you speak about agroecology, it's a more scientific sounding name that
the opportunity
is maybe less
and source
strong
from
and resonates
farmers,
with people a bit less.
There's a lot of substance behind
just
that.
from a marketing perspective,
So,
I think that was something.
Yeah, you're right. It's important to define it, but I would say, please, let's not turn this into yet another box-ticking exercise.
One thing I will say in favor of regenerative agriculture as well is that, in my opinion, it's a much stronger term in terms of marketing. We need as many people as possible to get behind this movement, including businesses, politicians, innovators, students, marketers, all kinds of people. And if you talk about transitioning from a destructive and extractive model of agriculture towards a regenerative one, it's really easy to understand and to get behind. It's all in the title. And if you speak about agroecology, it's a beautiful term as well, and I love it, but it maybe sounds a bit more scientific and it's a bit less, the emotional reaction from people maybe is not as powerful.
Yeah, that's what got me excited. And going back to the beginning of this conversation, extractive, regenerative. Extractive, we've treated the soil like a mine and fertility like a resource. And we've been taking out fertility of the soil, millennium after millennium, decade after decade, year after year. And now we can add fertility back.
This is probably the perfect moment to wrap up our conversation for today. Thank you so much, Chuck, for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been an amazing conversation for me. I wish you all the best and thank you.
Thank you, Raphael.